With that, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, a current Rollins senior, double majoring in anthropology and religion with minors in MENA and Jewish studies. While holding her titles as the Bonner Leader, Resident Assistant, and VP of the Muslim Student Union, she has been fighting a Title IX case for long over a year. During her time fighting this battle, she has been named as a finalist to study Urdu in India this summer with the Critical Language Scholarship through U.S. State Department, semi-finalist for the English Teachers Assistance in Nepal with the Fulbright Scholarship through the U.S. State Department, Fiat Lux recipient, and an inductee of the Phi Beta Kappa. Today, she will share a SparkNotes version of her story with us. Her resilience is unimaginable, and her willingness to be vulnerable, to educate and strengthen all of us goes to show just how brave she truly is. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Jacqueline Bengtson.
Of support and advocacy here in this room with me today. I want to take a moment to have a moment of silence to honor all survivors of sexual abuse and violence for their power and strength. A little over 3 years ago, I sat in this very audience. It was a crowded audience for the incredible and powerful Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement. She stood in her power on this very stage, educating the Rollins community on how to be advocates for victims of sexual abuse. I hope that I can channel her strength and courage in me tonight. A year ago this week, I was disempowered by my greatest mentor, educator, and professor of one of my favorite subjects, Dr. Mario D'Amato, a professor of Buddhist philosophy. My life changed. I lost so much. Other professors, trust, opportunities, studying with the religion department, but intrinsically, I gained more than I lost. Genuine support from new mentors, open doors for new educational opportunities, and more importantly, personal strength and courage. A year later, I am standing empowered to tell my story as a platform to enact positive change. In the federal and Rollins College Title IX process, educate my peers on the nature of power dynamics, disseminate knowledge on resources available, and allow myself to close this chapter in my life and finally begin to heal. On each of our paths to develop our passions and realize our goals and dreams, we are to anticipate challenges. I did not know, however, that when I came to Rollins, simply trying to pursue my passions would traumatize me the way it did. I came on campus during my first semester, like any first year, eager to get involved and grow as a leader. My tenacity to advocate for myself led me directly to Dr. D'Amato's office, a week before classes began. I come from a diverse community in Concord, New Hampshire. I grew up with new American students from all over the world. I was a part of a club called the Be the Change Club that inspired multicultural awareness, education throughout the school, and provided opportunities to celebrate diversity. I felt closest to my new American friends. In fact, last fall, I was the maid of honor for my best friend from Rwanda. And naturally, with being a part of this club, celebrating cultures from the world and practicing world religions, it was easy for me to choose my first major, to study religion. I elected after high school to take a gap year and explore my religious passions further. Today, with all of my religious interests, I consider myself, just as gender can be fluid, so too can a religious affiliation. I love to immerse myself in all religious traditions and celebrate the belief systems of the world. So during my gap year, I had the privilege to live and serve in an ashram in New York, a Hindu temple for meditation and yoga. It was there that the swamis taught me Sanskrit first. I learned the alphabet, I chanted in Sanskrit, and I was inspired by it. It's a beautiful language that holds so much spiritual significance. Every syllable is connected to a deity, is connected to a specific element of earth, and it's all interconnected. Studying the language is studying how to be spiritual with oneself. I was fortunate to be able to study in Nepal before my first semester here at Rollins, where I lived as well in a Buddhist monastery and served with monks there. So naturally, I wanted to feel at home at Rollins. And so when I found out there was an Asian religions professor, I knew I had to first take his class, which led me straight to his door. He quickly became one of my favorite professors. While shocked at how he conducted his class during my first semester by using sexual humor to lighten up and liven up the class, no one questioned it, as he would attribute it to his Italian heritage and time in the army. In fact, he was praised for it. Yeah, Dr. D'Amato is the best, super funny Italian guy. He's not afraid to swear and joke about sex. My peers would often comment if his name or class came up in conversation. I admired him and respected him for his expertise and commitment to support the students. So I did not question it either. He has been the favorite of many students who have come and gone through Rollins. So was I really naive to trust him? I have taken several classes with D'Amato, my first being my first semester. He was on sabbatical and I didn't have a chance to take a formal class with him until my second semester of my sophomore year. But I had no passion for Sanskrit, and Dr. D'Amato knew Sanskrit. He was actually teaching another student privately in an independent study, and of course, me being an advocate to learn and discover new languages, I was like, I want to join too. I want to be a part of this class. And eventually I started my first Sanskrit sessions with him. I was obviously a beginner. The previous and former student was more advanced, so our sessions were one-on-one. And I began to notice a difference between the way in which I studied Sanskrit at the ashram and the way in which D'Amato conducted his Sanskrit classes, similar to those of his Asian religion classes. But I hope to continue my exploration of it with him. And in my private Sanskrit lessons that lasted 3 semesters, my sophomore spring, junior fall, and junior spring, I was blinded to his harassment, attributing it with the shared belief that it's just Dr. D'Amato. But it was my Sanskrit class on April 7th, almost a year ago this week, that shook me awake to the abuse I'd been in denial of for my 3 years of mentorship under him. To my knowledge, I was the only one who felt this way, who realized what I had been experiencing. I closed the gap on April 7th, but put up until then, I didn't see the gap on who I perceived him to be versus what he was doing to me. I believe that I was groomed by Dr. Mario D'Amato, and his pattern of behavior proved to be true for 4 other survivors who were revealed during the investigation. The 4 revealed were only within the last 4 years. He was an employee for the college for 16 years. With his confirmed pattern of behavior, who knows how many more are out there. I hope to explain to my peers what I mean by grooming and teach you so you can know signs of such abuse. Defined by the wonderful and amazing Sarah Ahmed, grooming describes a process that has an end in sight. And until you reach that end, it is hard to notice the process. The process works by not making the end clear until it's too late. My end was April 7th. Mind the gap is a phrase that refers to the gap between how someone appears to act and how they actually are acting. Some can abuse the power they have been given by how they do not appear. D'Amato used this very gap in his position of power. He did not appear as a harasser. He was just a funny guy. I couldn't see that gap, nor could others. It was inconspicuous to everyone. His harassment hid behind his persona. Like grooming behavior, harassment does not always reveal itself fully at once or even at first. Ahmed explains how it can be a series of actions performed over time, with slight differences in each speech and private interactions. It's a gradual pushing back of boundaries, and it changes in his or perpetrator's behavior, speech, and private interactions. His harassment grew more frequent during the latter end of fall semester 2020 and during the spring semester of 2021 in my private sessions with him. To name a few to give context, I want to explain how he created power and trust in our relationship from the beginning of our mentorship relationship. Now, as I came in as a freshman, having lived in Nepal and wanting to eagerly pursue my passions here at Rollins, I questioned whether or not I was fit and for an institution of academia and education. I wanted to study Sanskrit with swamis in India, perhaps even living in an ashram for the rest of my life. But D'Amato reassured me on our walk back to his office, as he often would do with most of his students. Within the first three weeks of my first semester at college, he said, "No, Jacqueline, this is your dharma, in Buddhist terms, your duty, to be here in school. Finish your degree, and then you can do whatever you want, but I'll be here to help you." Oh, okay, yes. He can be here to support me. He knows where I'm at, and I can trust him, of course. Everyone loves him. When I would meet with him after class or during his office hours, which I typically do to all my professors, thank you very much for putting up with all my questions, we talked about my fears and trepidations for the future after college. Being entrapped in academia, I fell in love with it, as hard it was to adapt to at first. And I even saw myself being a professor, perhaps even a professor of religion, like D'Amato. And he would share his advice on mentoring other students who led similar paths to become professors themselves. And in one of our sessions, my very malleable mind was eager to hear and take heed to his advice and apply it to my life. He told me in one of our sessions, he said, "Jacqueline, if you want to be a professor of religion, if you want to be a professor, it is very competitive and you need to prove yourself now. You have," he said it exactly as such, "you have to get a 4.0. No A minuses, a 4.0. Wow, okay, I left that meeting scared to death because that's a high expectation. But after my first semester, wow, I had my first semester at 4.0. And then it just kept happening each semester, and I was like, okay, I can pursue my passions of potentially being in graduate school. But there was exceptions. He said that I can help you in any way possible, but I'll be your mentor. But you have to get a 4.0. During our subsequent Sanskrit sessions that started in the spring of my sophomore year, we would usually start our sessions catching up, talking about classes. He would ask questions about my family, and kindly in return, I would ask him how his siblings were doing. We were close, but the gradual grooming process leaped into new territory when he started talking about his personal life more explicitly. In the fall of 22, he reminisced with me unsolicitedly about his summer romance he had in Mexico and the great fun it was. He would often, as Dar said, this section of my speech is a trigger warning, and I just want to preface that again. He would often, in our one-on-one sessions, make me role play. He wanted me to speak in different accents for several minutes, and he even wanted me to research more accents to practice with him for his own amusement. It was strange and uncomfortable request, but I engaged in those roles because of the power dynamic. I did not want to disappoint him. Often in our sessions, he gradually grew to not respect my time more and more. As our weekly sessions would last an hour and a half, they ended up by the spring of 2022 turning into 3 or 4 hour meetings. I had to even make excuses to leave. Thank you, Thomas, for being a great excuse. I would say I'm getting dinner with my brother. I have to leave at 7. He's a very timely person. And of course, I talked about my family. I'm so close to them. He wanted to learn about my 3 older brothers and the silly stories of growing up with them. He learned that my family and close friends call me Missy. In fact, that's really my name, but Jacqueline is just my legal name, but it's the most endearing name to me. And he elected to call me that himself, even in front of my peers in the classroom. In the classroom, he would praise me for my character unnecessarily. I recognized later and retrospectively, it was another way that he separated me from others, as not just special, but special to him. Dr. D'Amato would always tell me how smart I am, how good I am at learning languages, and how I can start in the 2nd year of Sanskrit when I begin grad school. He also frequently would tell me how, with his help, I can get into the most prestigious grad school, which greater defines the growing power dynamic. As I mentioned before, Sanskrit is a beautiful and sacred language, and I honor its spiritual significance. But for him, the classes were another opportunity to talk about sex with me, degrading our work of translating the Hindu epic of the Ramayana, incredible if you're fascinated with Hindu history, as merely an opportunity for fun and games, a chance for him to just amuse himself. He often would act overbearing. In one instance, he said he saw me with a boy he recognized in the CC, or the campus cafeteria, and he assured me that the boy had good taste. One time I approached him, and it was the spring of 2021. COVID was slowly dissipating, and I was anxious about opportunities for fellowships or more learning opportunities in the summer, as any diligent student is. And of course, you're supposed to ask your mentor. They have all the resources to provide you adequate support. But instead, he said, Jacqueline, or rather at this time he would say, Missy, you should smoke weed this summer and get a summer lover. And he never ended up giving me advice. My end on April 7th allowed me to be able to look back at my 3 years with him and see this gradual process retrospectively. What happened April 7th left me in fear. I feared what would happen if I continued to go back to class with him alone. I will read to you sections of my formal complaint, a reflection chronicling this vivid experience. On Wednesday, April 7th, at approximately 4:30 p.m., I was in my weekly Sanskrit class with Dr. D'Amato in the lounge of French House. Like any other class, we would take the first 20 minutes or so to catch up, and I asked him how he was feeling after COVID-19. We sat on different couches with our masks on. During this April 7th conversation, he said, you know, Missy, I have just had a newfound understanding of what I teach and what I went through with COVID. He was referring to ascetics, people who deny themselves certain parts of existence to achieve a heightened awareness or level of spirituality by separating themselves from the ordinary world and focus entirely on God. Often when you don't eat as much, all desires fall away. For example, if you don't eat, you don't have desires for sexual intercourse. He said, when I tell you this, I can't look at you. I said, okay, I won't look at you either. I looked forward and looked down. He said, I'm a very sexual person. I jerk off all the time. I was shocked and thought to myself, am I listening to this? Did he really just say that? I didn't know what to say. and nothing. He said he would often wake up and jerk off to go back to sleep. I completely froze. I thought I couldn't see my professor in the same way anymore and didn't know what our relationship had come to. He told me his cousin called him when he was sick and asked him if he had been masturbating, and Dr. D'Amato said to the cousin, "No, it's crazy, I haven't." He said he told another specific professor about not being able to masturbate while he was sick, and said professor told him about ascetics. He looked at me again and said, "I haven't told this to any woman except for my sister and you." Like before, I felt extremely uncomfortable. I did not know what to say, but felt like I had to say something. In a quick response, I gave him a thumbs up and said, "It's okay, I'm a good confidant, people can tell me anything." I didn't know what else to do. Then he said, "On that note, let's get into Sanskrit," as if nothing had happened. I tried to do the translation, but was in a total state of shock. I went to dinner with my brother that evening, and later repeatedly all I could think was, why did he tell me that? Why did he tell me that? Why did he tell me that? I didn't know how to process what happened. I was scared and was shaking. I've cried so much about this. At first, I thought I'm just going to go on and pretend like everything is normal, but after opening up to family and friends, I knew that I had to report him. This was bigger. I felt Dr. D'Amato inferred as he was making the hand motions and looking at me when he said he wasn't going to, that he thought of me when he masturbates at night and can't go back to sleep. I was floored, sad, frustrated, and devastated. He was my mentor. I asked him to be my thesis advisor because we were excited about my thesis topic, using India as a case study of Muslim-Hindu discord. I now do not have an Asian studies professor for my thesis and do not have a teacher for Sanskrit. I probably cannot take any more Asian studies classes. It's not fair, I must suffer because he chose to conduct himself in a perverted manner. Once this event happened, it made all previous interactions with him flood back to the forefront of my mind. Honestly, I didn't pay much attention to his comments in the past because I just accepted that that is just who Dr. D'Amato is, and that is how he teaches. But on April 7th, he went over the line. It made me realize that I should not just have to accept that that is how he teaches because it is brutally disrespectful. Furthermore, it is scary to speak out against an authority figure such as a well-respected, tenured, and successful professor. Although he has many accolades and has been in the Rollins community for several years, it does not grant him the ability to speak so profanely and disrespect me as a student with excellent character. I questioned at the time if I should now have to suffer because I'm finally speaking up. Should I have to suffer and not be given the same opportunities as a student who finds joy in learning because that's just who Dr. D'Amato is? And should I just accept that? It's unacceptable, and Dr. D'Amato should know better. As a professional at Rollins College, he should know how to treat his students with respect and refrain from crude and offensive language and information, such as his personal sex life with me on April 7th. That does not enhance the learning experience. The nature of his harassment towards me, as what I deemed to be grooming behavior, was confirmed in the statement of responsibility by the panel after the hearing. Taken by itself, Dr. D'Amato's course of conduct towards Bengtson, it says, Bengtson was severe and inappropriate. But when considered in relation to the credible accounts of survivors A, B, C, and D, Dr. D'Amato's course of conduct towards Bengtson appears to be part of a pattern of inappropriate behavior directed at female students, particularly student mentees. The similarities between experiences recounted by Bengtson, survivors A, B, C, and D demonstrate that D'Amato's actions towards Bengtson were not isolated missteps in judgment. Instead, these 5 accounts were evidence of a repeated pattern in which D'Amato has built a close relationship with a female student, gradually tested the limits of that relationship with comments and humor of a sexual nature, and discussion of their personal lives, and escalated his behavior over time to a point where comments and humor of a sexual nature become personal to Dr. D'Amato and or the student. In light of this apparent pattern, the character of D'Amato's behavior towards Bengtson is rendered more severe. I hope to elevate a greater awareness of signs of abuse so that sexual violence does not have to be proven with a teleological end. I encourage each and every one of you to mind the gap, as difficult as it is. It starts with noticing changes in behavior of those especially in positions of power over you, and noticing if there are subtle changes and how it makes you feel. We are conditioned to put up with behaviors that transgress boundaries, however far, and instead we question ourselves and our own credibility because we have to be conditioned to see what has always appeared to be true without seeing what actually is occurring. Sometimes, even now, I cannot discern the gap, if I'm being honest, and question if I am justified, deeming my plight to be less than significant because it was just harassment, not physical abuse. Further, because of the ability to not be able to mind the gap, we will often justify their behavior, almost denying to myself by saying he was my mentor, my professor who I trusted and confided in. Pushing back against what we are expected to tolerate is hard to do, especially when, quote unquote, complaining and reporting is deemed inconvenient for receiving parties. There is no one way to detect abuse, to notice the grooming behaviors in the process. It is the very nature of these behaviors that make it nearly impossible to spot. Rollins College is a liberal arts institution. It inspires us to think critically, but I, a critical thinker in so many different disciplines, could never critically think about what was happening in front of me until April 7th. I encourage you all to listen to yourself and how you feel in relationships with intrinsic power dynamics. If you're uncomfortable and experience behavior that transcends the boundaries of those relationships in any way, I hope you can remember to prioritize your mental health. Remove yourself from the situation, reach out to support systems provided to you, report to appropriate parties, or just tell a friend, whatever is best for you. We are entrenched in power dynamics and will continue to be. It is how our society is structured. We ultimately hope to trust people in positions of power, elected government officials to make decisions best in our favor, our employer for properly managing a business while ensuring a safe work environment, and our professors to share their knowledge from years of rigorous study and application of their discipline. I want to remind my peers specifically that as you continue your journey at Rollins, and out of Rollins with future employers, you will continue to have to situate yourself within socially constructed power structures. No matter how well respected, how knowledgeable, or how much experience someone has over you, no power dynamic should ever sanction you to be subjugated to abuse, lack of opportunities, exploitation, and the list goes on. Even while I stand here on the other side today, I still have to subconsciously erase the notion that it wasn't as bad as it could have been, continually rejecting the expectations that I have to justify his behavior because he was so well loved and respected and accomplished. I want to remind you that you're not alone, and there are armies of activists on your side, some you know, like all in this room, or others you may never meet. Your voice and experiences are valid and important in this collective effort to make positive change and prevent abuse by holding all people and institutions of power accountable for their transgressions. Not only do we trust people in power, but institutions of power. I trusted as a student that Rollins would be there to support and protect me, but as the president recognized, they failed me. When we think of institutions, we conjure up an idea of something greater than us that we can believe in. But really, as one of my mentors reminds me, the institution is not greater than us because it is us. We are Rollins right here. We create the scaffolding that keeps the institution standing, but it can change however challenging it may be. From my experience, I will be calling for specific reforms in the federal and Rollins Title passion to prevent abuse of current students and students yet to come. What is Title IX? Some of you may even ask. Title IX of the Educational Amendment of 1972 prohibits any person in the United States from being discriminated against on the basis of sex in seeking access to any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The U.S. Department of Education, which enforces Title IX, has long defined the meaning of Title IX's prohibition on sex discrimination broadly to include various forms of sexual harassment and sexual violence that interfere with a student's ability to equally access Rollins College's educational programs and opportunities. The policies within my process were from the issuing during the 2020 administration. The next review is ongoing since 2021. Rollins has to adhere to the 2020 policies with additional Rollins-specific policies in place. There are several paths that can be taken within Title IX, but I hope to educate you all on the specific process I had to willingly endure. After meeting with a non-mandatory reporter on campus and confiding in friends, all who are here today, on Fox Day of last year, I met with the director of Title IX to file a report for Rollins policy. At this time, I had not decided if I wanted to file a formal complaint and go through a formal or informal proceeding. According to the federal policy, reporting incidents of discrimination on the basis of sex and sexual harassment informs the college of the incident, which allows the institution to provide supportive measures to the complainant and does not necessarily result in the initiation of the formal grievance process or informal resolution process. I want to take a moment to remind you, as Dar so eloquently did at the beginning, of the resources at the door for mental health resources and also ways in which you can report. The first step in this process was writing a formal complaint, written and submitted solely by me. At this time, I was hesitant. I thought that I was the only one. I questioned the ramifications of filing a formal complaint and wondered if you would still be working on campus during my senior year. Title IX still could choose to undergo a formal or informal process, but ultimately it can be overridden by the coordinator of Title IX if they deem an investigation and formal proceeding as necessary. After the Title IX committee met based on my complaint, it was deemed necessary for a formal proceeding. I endured the formal grievance process. It lasted 5 months, and it hopefully maybe ends today, but it's ongoing. Living on campus, being reminded of everything that happened, not being able to go to the French house, my favorite place to study at one point. The next step in the process was for me to compile a list of witnesses I thought could be relevant to the investigator. It was really confusing at this point for me, and I had no idea what I really signed up for, but I knew that I could do it. I knew that whatever was going to happen was supposed to happen, and as I said before, this is bigger than I ever thought it was. Once I met with the Title IX coordinator to share my story, and I gave her a formal complaint, I received a notice of allegations. Within the report, it provided the model's alleged transgression against federal and Rollins Title IX policy. After reading the notice of allegations, I had to write my first of 5 responses to be a part of the record. If anyone has taken a class with me or has been one of my professors, you know I have a hard time writing papers that fall in the requested page limit. I love the writing process and end up writing more pages than required in my paper. Continually writing reports in this process, though, proved to be so arduous for me. It took days and hours for me to complete and consumed my life. I next had to secure an advisor. And here, this is where it places victims at a disadvantage. The respondent typically in these proceedings disproportionately secure attorneys in comparison to victims. If I did not have a lawyer, this case would not have been seen through the way it was, especially with my lawyer's support, knowledge, and expertise. The privilege of my position to have retained a lawyer reminded me not to give up. It was a fight not just for me, but the survivors of D'Amato who were revealed in the investigation and those not known. After securing an advisor, the investigation could proceed. The school hired an outside investigator, and it lasted from May to July. I had an initial meeting with the investigator. It lasted 6 hours straight, with one 5-minute bathroom break. I had that much to say. But it didn't end there. There were multiple hours of long interviews with this investigator, and they would send me constant emails for follow-up questions and asking for points of clarification on things I would say or things other witnesses would say. The investigation process was relentless, and I couldn't ever escape it, even when I tried to at my sister-in-law's bachelorette party. Inspection and review of the evidence proceeded in July. This is when it got really hard. I had to, as the victim, read through 46 witness statements, approximately 150 single-space pages. And before then, I didn't know there were other survivors out there. But reading through these pages, I couldn't. It was so re-traumatizing to eerily read the similar accounts that would happen to other mentees who I knew, but I didn't know it was happening to them too. I also had to examine 45 exhibits, which was approximately 70 pages, and the federal process gave me 10 days to read, and then I had to write a response to that evidence. Naturally, and of course, as you should, I requested an extension, but even still, to this day, I haven't been able to read all of those witness statements. I just can't, and I should have never been expected to. Following the inspection and review of evidence, the investigator wrote an investigative report. This was a 60 single-space pages. It was issued about 10 days prior before the scheduled hearing that was in August. It provided a fair summary of evidence by the investigator and proved me far more credible than D'Amato. But again, I had to write yet another response to the investigative report. It never ended. And then the hearing came. It was slated to last 4 days, but it ended up being 2 weeks. From 9 to 5, almost every day. There was a panel of 3 decision makers. Rollins hired a hearing chair outside from the school who specializes in Title IX matters. And honestly, she's a badass. I'm so glad they hired her. They also appointed 2 faculty members appointed on the panel who had no connection to either D'Amato or I. We initially, my lawyer and I had to work with the hearing chair to not dismiss certain witnesses we deemed relevant. And I also want to take time to mention that in this process and in this hearing, I had to prepare an opening statement and closing statement. If anyone has seen Law and Order, you know that a lawyer is always going to do that for their client. But I, the victim, had to do it myself, or else there wasn't going to be an opening or closing statement. I had to be cross-examined by the panel and each advisor, and I had to sit through all the witnesses. And through this whole process, as As I mentioned before, I'm so close with my family, they couldn't be a part of any of it. They weren't allowed to hear any of the witnesses in the hearing, to read any of the witness statements. It was privilege between my lawyer and I, and it pained me. I tell my family everything. Especially, it was painful during one of the most hardest experiences in my life. Finally, after the hearing, there was a determination of responsibility. This was given by the end of August, essentially right before the beginning of my senior year. I could close the door and start fresh. The panel found Dr. D'Amato responsible for violating 3 policies. Their sanctions were termination from employment, which the college is subject to abide by. The determination also notably stated, the panel also found D'Amato's demonstration of remorse to be inadequate, which led the panel to conclude that Dr. D'Amato would repeat his conduct at issue in this process. D'Amato expressed remorse for causing Bengtson distress, particularly insofar as April 7th conversation may have triggered Bengtson to experience negative symptoms of past trauma. However, D'Amato did not acknowledge that his conduct towards Bengtson was inappropriate, regardless of Bengtson's response to it. D'Amato's written response and statements in the hearing showed that he did not view his conduct towards Bengtson as wrong or inappropriate, nor understood why he should be held accountable for such conduct. D'Amato did not indicate willingness to change his behavior in response to the information gathered by the process or the live testimony of Bengtson and witnesses. For these reasons, the panel found that D'Amato is unlikely to respond positively to rehabilitative education or discipline, and if D'Amato is permitted to remain in his position at the college, he will likely repeat the same conduct towards students. For the foregoing reasons, the panel determined that it is appropriate and proportionate to separate D'Amato from employment at the college. But naturally, in these proceedings, he is allowed an appeal process. And once he filed for an appeal, at the last minute, right before the start of the semester, he requested an extension. And again, I had to write a personal impact statement. He was granted an extension which delayed the sanctions of his termination far into the beginning of the fall semester. And by this point, while I once had hopes of starting fresh, I was already significantly behind in all my classes, a phenomenon never representative of me prior to this experience. From my experience, I have specific calls would be formed in the federal and Rollins College Title IX process. 1. The federal and Rollins Title IX procedure must change in validating language. They use language as complainant versus respondent. I was complainant. There's intrinsically negative connotation to the word complainant. I'm deemed a problem. And when you are a complainer, you are not heard and your voice is not validated enough. Perhaps it can be changed to reporting party, rather than a title that linguistically challenges my right to be taken seriously. 2, the federal Title IX policy and the college's policy must work to limit the amount of burden on victims and reporting parties. Ultimately, I, as the victim, had to do most of the work myself, while still trying to be a student. Students should not have to participate as frequently as I was expected to in order to lessen burdens placed on victims. The policy states that the college has a long-standing practice of requiring students to participate in the process directly and not through an advocate or representative. The additional harm done to me from the process cannot be undone. It took my courage to remove him, and the burden of my responsibility to rid a school of an abuser should never fall on a student. 3, I hope Rollins can continue to make provisions that hold faculty accountable. Specifically for Rollins, they must legally abide to Title IX policies, but that does not mean that it is what they already are doing. I was not the first to file a report on D'Amato. One specific faculty member was assigned to address this complaint in 2017. They personally met with D'Amato and sent him an email regarding the complaint. This faculty member considered the meeting a counseling and a warning for the potential of Title IX should his behavior continue. There was no follow-up. In the years to follow, it happened again to can report. Other faculty, specifically professors in the religion department, were complicit to his behavior. I'm not here to assign blame, and while past disregard to signs of his abuse cannot be undone, we must look to the future. Rollins can enact policies that support victims and hold professors accountable. There are required provisions at the school for professors to report such behavior, but specifically in my example, they are not utilized. Professors fall in the category of required reporters. Faculty, specifically in his department, knew bits and pieces of D'Amato's behavior, which they relayed to me and subsequently denied to the investigator. Those who knew him and had the same general reaction. They weren't surprised. The next time required reporters feel this way, they need to speak up. And with that, lack thereof, there should be greater obligatory motivations, especially because my example proves that while spotting abuse may be questionable in public, it is clear behind doors. UF has these provisions that should be considered for Rollins too. At UF, the university regulations require employees to participate in the investigation when contacted by the Office for Accessibility and Gender Equity. There is a culture among faculty that they fear speaking up for the jeopardy that it would place on them in their career. And it's true, it's acknowledged. But instead, provisions should be enacted so that spotted abuse does not go unaccounted for, and faculty should fear the ramifications of not saying something instead. 4, to all, complaints and reporters should be considered with seriousness, assessing the potential for continued harm. If the other survivors were not found and their testimonies included, it would have been even more challenging for me to see this process through. It shouldn't take 5 victims for it to matter. One person speaking out with credible evidence is already one more than there should be. It is embedded in society's refusal to hear complaints and take victims seriously. 5, the federal Title IX process should limit the burden of witnesses, which re-traumatizes victims discovered through investigation process. I discovered later in this initial investigation, witnesses are not able to know the scope of why they're being questioned, where exactly their statements are going, and what protections are in place for them too. Survivors exploited as witnesses should have greater rights and support networks when they are questioned in the process. If I had known this, I would have never wished to subjugate survivors of D'Amato to this process in the first place. 6, the Rollins Title IX office should work to prioritize the mental health and well-being of victims over perpetrators. Yes, there must be a fair and equitable trial for each party, but the burden of responsibility fallen on the victim disadvantages the victim from the start. In the federal policy on administrative leave for employers, the college retains the authority to place non-student employee respondent on administrative leave during the Title IX grievance process. In the spring of 2021, D'Amato was allowed to keep teaching until the end of the semester, while I had to file a no-contact order and fear seeing him walking around on campus. He finished teaching that spring, while I had to pause school and apply for incompletes in all of my classes. Regarding appeals, after the trial, the deadline for D'Amato to file an appeal was closing. We were hopeful to get the decision of the panel, but he was granted an appeal, as well as a long extension into the semester, hindering me from being able to start my senior year with this behind me. I hope that if a case comes to the point of appeals again, the mental health of the victim is prioritized by consulting with the complainant in person, not email, about the potential for an extension of appeal or lessening the extension to ease the mental harm of the victim. Instead, I had to wait well into the start of my senior year to hear the decision of the appellate officer. And while I waited, he was on a leave of absence, which is the last students heard of him. Lastly, and succinctly, victims should have the right to an attorney provided to them. I'm almost done. I believe it is essential for professors to possess academic freedom in the pursuit of advancing knowledge. Academic freedom defends the right for faculty to express themselves freely in public, engage in unconventional ways of thinking, and to challenge and question ideas. Essentially, to be critical thinkers in their day-to-day lives. But it still urges professors to exercise appropriate restraint. In freedom and academic tenure. It states, once appointed, the scholar has professional functions to perform in which the appointing authorities have neither competency nor moral right to intervene. The responsibility of the university teacher is primarily to the public itself and not to the judgment of his own professionalism. The revised statement in 1940 sought to protect scholars' freedom of research, freedom of teaching, and freedom of extramural utterances and actions. This policy is present in most institutions of higher education in the United States, including Rollins. As a scholar, I do not believe that such protection should be under threat. From my experience, however, I wholeheartedly agree with the Dean at Yale Law School, Robert Post, that academic freedom is not free speech. According to Post, First Amendment rights are individual, but academic freedom applies to a discipline, meaning a community of inquiry. The lines are often blurred in the academy. From my experience, I too have found the lines between academic freedom and freedom of speech to be ambiguous. I speak on this topic today because from the testimonies of faculty witnesses in the investigation and hearing, it continues to be ambiguous at Rollins too. When one faculty member was questioned why the 2017 complaint was not pursued further than a slap on the wrist email, then filed only to be resurrected during my investigation, they argued for protecting his academic freedoms. I believe his behavior was not protected in his tenure position, but he spoke under his right to freedom of speech. It is this very notion of, quote, freedom of expression, end quote, that Dr. D'Amato defined his persona. It was his free expression that was edgy and crude and engaged in sexual humor within and outside of the classroom. We all believed his persona, the funny Italian professor that wasn't afraid to talk about sex in class. It was easy to think his humor was harmless. It was not directed towards any student, and until I was alone with him or in our independent study, it was not personal to him. I'll give you an example. One day in Buddhist ethics, the topic of the day was eradicating the three poisons in Buddhism: passionate attachment, passionate aversion, and delusion. A common example some may use is passionate attachment to, say, chocolate. For D'Amato, sometimes he would use his love of cheesecake to explain how this poison never permanently satisfies humans, but other times he would talk about sex. On this day, he explained, what if you and your partner got it on, as he would often say, and it was the most mind-blowing experience of your life? Would you be so satisfied? No, you'd want to do it again. This was typical for D'Amato. It wasn't out of the ordinary, it didn't target anyone, it was not questioned. But these are the very examples that build up, conditioning me and others to accept it as his, quote, personal expression, end quote, as a tenured professor. But was his engagement with sexual humor in class freedom of teaching or freedom of speech? Or when he asked the class before the session began about Snapchat, and if it's, quote, that app that you all use to send naked pictures to one another and it disappears, end quote. He has freedoms to teach as a tenured professor, but how can he not be held accountable, especially when such unaccountability escalates to serial harassment? While he connected his sexual humor to class content, it was not solicited by students in the class, and it certainly was not the only example to drive home the point of that day's lesson. He situated this pattern of behavior within the classroom as a protection of academic freedom within the protections of AAUP. But it was this very perceived protection that allowed him to push the boundaries further with me in our one-on-one Sanskrit lessons. The lines separating academic freedom and freedom of speech get blurrier in the Title IX process. The Title IX grievance policy for addressing discrimination on the basis of sex, including sexual harassment, speaks on freedom of expression within Section 2 General Rules and Applications. It states, freedom of expression and principles of academic freedom are central to the mission of institutions of higher education. Yes, agreed. The right to free expression cannot be considered sexual harassment under this policy. However, sexual harassment is not the proper exercise of free expression. The boundaries of freedom of expression did not prevent D'Amato's behavior as a serial sexual harasser. He continued sexual harassment towards me and other survivors, and it went unchecked with his protection from tenure, and based on Title IX, the sexual harassment grievance policy, his freedom of expression as a professor was not have enough roadblocks to prevent sexual harassment. In fact, it secured how D'Amato, quote, did not see a problem at all, end quote, in his behavior, which he continuously attested throughout the investigation and trial. What now? To Rollins, if a complaint is received in the future that brings into question the protections of professors' academic freedom, I hope for it to be considered with scrutiny, considering patterns and potential for harm. My case with D'Amato reveals that with his use of sexual humor and sexual examples was seemingly harmless to students. The lack of boundaries allowed him to traumatize students beyond the visibility of the public eye. For the federal Title IX process, the right of free expression can and should be considered a case for sexual harassment. Academic freedom is important, but should not perpetuate the ability for abusers to do harm, and when deemed so, should be overridden by the Title IX process. I stand here stronger and empowered and in solidarity with the survivors of D'Amato who came before me. A dear friend reminded me that while I hope to instill passion for change in others from this talk, I must consider what I want out of this talk personally. I believe that while it has been a year, it's almost as if I get to tell my story for the first time. I've walked on campus for a year with this burden on my shoulders, and only a handful of people knew. I tell you my story today to release the burden I've been carrying for far too long. I've done everything that I can in this process, and now I must finally start to heal. I tell my story to release all that I have carried, so that my story can not only be heard, but used to enact positive and necessary change. I want to take the time to acknowledge very special and significant people in my life that this process and me standing here would not have happened without them. Of course, my mom and dad, and my amazing 3 older brothers, Thomas, Matthew, Benjamin, Thomas's partner, Gabrielle, for always being there for me to have a shoulder to cry on, my partner, Manish, for always being there to listen to all my complaints. I want to acknowledge Capri Gutierrez as the first person who I opened up my story to. He actually housed me during this whole process because I just couldn't sleep alone. I also want to thank my buddy Dar Bejarano and Charlie Newman. I want to thank Madhvi Molji for making sure sometimes I didn't sleep alone. Sebastian Hernandez for always being there for me since freshman year. Connor Ross, my incredible roommate, supporting me and being witness in the testimony, and still being her credible self in the testimony. She signed off and said, okay, bye. If anyone knows Connor, it was just incredible. I want to thank Sunny Tereki for being an advocate for justice on sexual violence. It was actually Sunny that brought Tarana Burke here 3 years ago, and I feel like her passion for justice in the Title IX process has manifested in me too. I want to thank my incredible friend Emily Curran. She's been my buddy since freshman year. She is a passion and a force to be reckoned with, and I'm so proud of her, and she inspires me. And I want to thank my buddy Farida Saeed. She is my buddy, and she will listen to me and support me no matter what. I also want to thank my professors and specific faculty members who supported me on my healing journey. Rev. Katrina Jenkins is like an aunt to me. I want to thank Dr. Hannah Carlin. While I lost all the professors in the religion department, I was blessed with Dr. Carlin, a true mentorship relationship, and I couldn't be more grateful. I am grateful for Bailey Clark, the director of the Bonner Leaders Program that brings me so much joy at Rollins. I was considering leaving, but it's Bonner, and it's being an RA, and it's being so involved, and having all of these connections that made me want to stay. I want to thank Meredith Hine and Nikki Meyer of the CLCE for always being there over the summer to listen and lend an ear. And I also want to thank my advisor, Dr. Ashley Kistler, for supporting me always as well. And I want thank all of you